All right, let's get started. So, hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jack Story. I do a lot of international relations. I study history and law. I mostly do international law and Middle East and African history. So I've kind of done a lot of it. And I really like international relations debates. I think they're the best form of debating. I think they're really fun. So I'm talking a little bit today specifically about knowing things in international relations. And the reason I'm talking about that is if you've done any other format, the actual structure of debates is very similar, right? Because the actors are the same, right? There's not like new magical actors that you're dealing with. Most of the time, you're dealing with politicians, which you already know about to debate about. You're dealing with leaders of ethnic or religious groups, you already know how to debate about them. If you're dealing with things like jihadist movements, those are just social movements, right? So if you've done debates about like other social movements like feminism, they translate in the same way. It's many of the same mechanisms work, right? If you talk about corporations or kind of big companies, similar mechanisms work. So mechanistically, it's not really a new field, right? It's just like you're doing it on a bigger scale. You've got more of them interacting with each other. But most of the time, what you need to focus on is not the mechanisms, but the thing that people get really stressed about, which is like, the info slide's talking about like Myanmar, and I don't know anything about Myanmar. How do I debate about that? So I think the most important thing to talk about is knowing things. So this is the structure of the presentation. I will put a lot of things on the slides. That's just because people always email me and are like, can I have the slides? I don't want them to be able to understand that, but don't worry if they're like big walls of text. Like I'm not gonna say all the things. We'll get through on time. All right, we're going to talk firstly about the basics of international relations debates. So that's sort of about stuff that you need to do to get by with that info slide. It's things like the world actors you're going to deal with and kind of the new actors you might not have experience with. And then I'll talk about why you shouldn't matter file, because people are always like, you need to have like a 500-page matter file, and that's kind of silly. Then I'll talk about when knowing things can be helpful. I'll give some examples of things I find quite interesting. And then finally, I'll talk about sources to know more. So I like podcasts. I'll talk a bit about podcasts, but of course, other stuff to get to know about it. All right, last thing, I've got a spot for questions like halfway through. So if you have questions, just like ask me then so I can like put up a slide with the QR code for internals while I do the questions. All right, first thing I'm going to talk about is getting by with that info slide. So I think you don't need to know very much to do an IFA, right? Most of the stuff I'm going to talk about in this presentation is not set knowledge. It's not information you need to have. It's just information that would be useful to have or like helps you generate extensions, which for those who might not have done it there before are in BP debates. The lower teams in the debates will have to come up with new arguments that the earlier teams didn't. So it's often like you might use your knowledge to come up with those kind of more niche examples. But there's a certain amount of stuff that you will need to know to kind of access these debates. And that's the stuff that won't come up in an info slide. And by that I mean, most international relations debates will have an info slide, right? They'll be like, well, China is supporting Myanmar in this way. And the motion will be like, this house, as the CCP, would stop supporting China or stop supporting Myanmar that way, right? That info slide will tell you how China is supporting Myanmar. What it won't tell you is who is the CCP and what do they care about, right? So give me some information that is implied in the emotion that you won't know about. Or for example, in this example, that Western states should support local rebel groups. This is kind of like a famous Campbelltown Australs debate. They don't give an info slide for this, right? So they're not telling you which rebel groups the Western states are supporting. They're not telling you how they do that. You kind of want to have a little baseline of knowledge so you know what the Western states are likely to be like, how they're likely to act. So I think in this category you have a couple of things. You firstly have the incentives of the largest global actors. So like you're never going to need to know about like the specific politics of, I don't know, like a minor actor like Taiwan. You're probably going to need to know about like the world's most large powers, right? Like you will get motions that are like this house as the US would do it, or this house as China would do something. So kind of that. Secondly, there are certain actors that you won't be familiar with, so ones that only exist on the world stage. Thirdly, there are extremely commonly discussed issues, so things like the war in Ukraine, you might want to have a good grasp on. And fourthly, if motions refer to states with a particular problem, so let's say the debate is like, in states experiencing ethnic conflict, we would do this housing policy. You might want to know what factors are correlative with states experiencing ethnic conflict, and you might want to be able to prove why those factors are correlative. So, let's talk about that. Firstly, dealing with actors on the world stage. So, many motions are going to say to you, you're going to debate about what China should do, or actually more difficultly, they're going to say, you are debating from the perspective of China, and you're going to tell me what would be useful and in China's interests, yeah? So, it's unlikely you're going to get one of those unless, so without an info slide, and that info slide would then say, these are the interests of this particular actor, there are only a very few states that you're likely going to expect to have knowledge about. And those states are really like the USA, the PRC, maybe in a stretch like India or Germany or like France or the UK, like kind of other ones, other really big countries. But basically there's very few states you need to have a grasp on. But what I would say about those states is that it would be useful to have basic facts about how they work. So, for example, I would focus on current political leadership, so just have a good grasp of like who runs China, right? It's Xi Jinping. Have a good grasp on a little bit of history. So you could talk about like the Mao era, or you could talk about kind of other kind of political relationships or other things you know about their past. That doesn't mean you have to know like the textbook of Chinese history. You don't have to know everything. Yes, the camera's still up. Awesome. You don't have to know everything about Chinese history, right? Like you don't have to be super spec'd up on it. but you want to have enough information so that if you're asked to debate what the CCP cares about, you can give a plausible explanation that the CCP probably cares about thing X and thing Y, right? You might say, well, after this instability for the Mao years, they probably care a lot about stability. They probably care a lot about maintaining power, etc. But I would also note, you can do benefit from going deeper. The CCP example, I will recommend books about this presentation if you want to read them. Susan L. Shirk, who runs the UC San Diego, I think, UC San Diego Center of China Studies, wrote a book called Overreach, which is specifically about how Chinese policymaking works. It's a really good book. And if you read that and have a lot of thoughts about Chinese policymaking, obviously you'll do those debates better, right? You'll know more about China, so you can debate more about what's in China's interest. But you don't need that information, right? The only information you need is like the most basic stuff, like who runs the country. Secondly, and the other kind of thing with actors, is you can also have certain institutions that you might not be familiar with. So you probably know what the USA and the PRC are. You might not know what these institutions are. So I would just read the front page of their Wikipedia, not even the full Wikipedia, just the top of their Wikipedia, so that you kind of know what's going on. Those are the Bretton Woods institutions, so that's the IMF and the World Bank. I would also add the World Trade Organization, and that's basically know what they do, right? The IMF does monetary stability stuff, so they'll give you out your loan, and if you pay back the loan or you don't pay back the loan, they'll have requirements. The World Bank does development stuff, right? They give you aid to reduce poverty. Kind of basic facts about what they might do. Similarly, the United Nations, so for example, a classic one is you might want to know that the UN Security Council is the one that sends out peacekeepers and authorizes the use of force, and it's also one that has veto power. So P5, which is France, UK, US, Russia, and China, can veto any decision there, right? So you might know, well, if there's debate about peacekeeping, let me explain why peacekeepers wouldn't be sent out in contexts that China is really unhappy with, because China has the veto power, so they can stop that happening. So kind of those really basic facts about that. And the third is certain transnational organizations. Someone asked me to talk about this. I think there's only really 3 you're ever going to get debates about. You might get a debate about the EU, kind of unlikely. You very plausibly will get one about the African Union or ASEAN. I would just know kind of really generic things about what those organizations are like, right? So the African Union, the one thing I would know about it is there's a big policy against recognizing separatist states. So there are often topics that are this house is the African Union, would no longer have that policy. But basically after decolonialization, to end wars over, or to prevent wars over borders, they just had a policy they would recommend all the borders and just recognize them all forever to prevent wars over gaining control of land. So something like that policy, or the ASEAN way, which is where they all agree not to intervene in each other's domestic affairs, which is really bad, for example, in Myanmar, because it means they don't intervene in the war in Myanmar and kind of support good groups. Knowing kind of those basic facts about the nation is kind of helpful. So, that may sound stressful. Basically all it means is just read the Wikipedia article of kind of those basic organizations and have kind of a decent grasp on what they might be about. Secondly, and the other kind of set of things I might want to have a grasp on, would be specific and general contexts. So, there are broadly 2 types of this. Specifically, occasionally you're going to get topics set that are about specific world conflicts or world events that you might not know, that you might not be info slide about, right? So classic ones would be the 2024 US election. They probably won't be info slide being this is between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. It would just be this house would support, for example, this house as the CCP supports Joe Biden in the election. It was a motion set kind of recently in Euros. That motion didn't tell you what the election was. So you kind of would want to have a basic facts of who is who, which parties they're running for, etc. Similarly, the Ukraine war gets a lot. So maybe have a little bit of a grasp on who's fighting the Ukraine war, where's it at right now, it's a stalemate, why is it a stalemate, because of artillery, that kind of basic facts about it. The ways to get this kind of knowledge, by the by, other than just reading the Wikipedia if you get really lost one time. And the answer is almost always you lose a debate, man, I wish I'd known about that, and then you learn about it. But the other option is just to read the news section of a major paper every so often. So if you ever subscribe, when your parents subscribe to the Sydney Morning Herald or something, just read the world section every 3 or 4 days. That'll almost always give you enough to get by on these kind of events. Finally, and I promise I'm going to stop talking about just stuff you should know in a second. More mechanistically, it is also useful to have explanations of why certain factors tend to correlate with other factors. Because this is, I think, the only part of proof in these kind of debates that is really tricky. So, the classic high school international relations debate is that Australia should not give foreign aid to countries with poor human rights records. Right? It's a very quintessential kind of not too difficult topic. But the thing that is a little bit tricky about that is kids will get up consistently at year 9, year 10, whatever, and they'll be well, countries with bad human rights records, they're really poor, so we should give them aid because they need development, right? The problem with that argument is that's not a logical gap, right? There's a logical gap of proving that countries that have poor human rights records are likely to need development aid and be less wealthy, right? They're likely to be developing. And there's a gap you need to prove there. So what I would do is I would have kind of a basic awareness of what kinds of countries is the motion talking about and what are some reasons why they might have other factors. For example, the ones you would teach your kids would just be like, well, if they have bad human rights records, that probably indicates they're undemocratic. So the government doesn't respond to society. So it probably doesn't make good societal planning because it has no incentive to. Kind of basic, like, here's a reason why thing A correlates with thing B. A similar one is, I think this is actually like Mexico worlds, like it's a very old worlds, maybe Thailand worlds, is that states with intra-gang violence. Sorry, Albert, do you know which one it is?
Thailand world.
It's Thailand worlds round 5, thanks everyone. Oh man.
This
guy's in first here, man. So, that states where intra-gang violence is a significant issue should seek to allow one organization to monopolize it, right? So like, if you have many cartels and they're all fighting each other, you should just be like, okay, Sinaloa cartel, you just get everything, and we're gonna let you run the show, right? That topic, you might want to spend a bit of time being like, well, states with intra-gang violence probably have very underdeveloped police forces. They probably have less capacity from the government. Often the government won't be in certain areas and the gangs will be providing resources and support. And you can give a bunch of reasons why that's likely to be true, right? Like, if there was a good police force, probably there wouldn't be a lot of intra-gang violence, right? Those two things probably imply each other. So, what I want you to do is like, have a little bit of a grasp, just from reading the news or like kind of keeping up to date on things, of what is likely to correlate with other factors. And that's, I think, kind of the fourth thing you want to have in your head. So, TLDR of these two slides is to get by without an info slide, there's not too much you need to do. All you need to do to like feel comfortable in pretty much any IR debate and not lose it and get a fourth because you know anything, is to know a little bit about like what the US and China and Russia want, a little bit about the Bretton Woods institutions or kind of other big, like this house as the World Bank would give development aid, or that the IMF should only give loans to countries of size X. Thirdly, things like the Ukraine war or the American election. And fourth, specific problems that can correlate with each other. So at that point, that's all you need to know to do well in IR debates. So the rest of this seminar, the next, whatever it is, like 47 minutes or 37 minutes, is likely to just be about things that you could know that you don't need to know. So let's drink of water. Does anyone have any questions so far? Awesome. Was that the beginning of your question, Abra? Or?
I was going to remark on punctuation.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just went up to let it notice.
Oh yeah, sorry. I figured it would be like really intimidating if the whole like wall of like when it gets to start talking about like African currencies, I figured if it was all capitals, people would think I was really cringe. So I made it all lowercase so that people would think I was more normal. Was my hope.
It's a bit cringe to actually think about that. Like,
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is mattifying. Because everyone thinks this is what you're meant to do. And it got a really bad rep when an American debater called Ryan Lafferty posted this after Vietnam Worlds, and this is his mattify. And it's 550 pages long. And like you open it and there's like a table of contents and a sub-table of contents, right? And everyone's like, oh no, the way you get good at debating is to spend like 3 years just like researching everything, every possible motion that could ever be a topic. You're just going to go read about it and have a bunch of notes about it. I would posit, and with all respect to Ryan Lafferty, who's quite good at debating, that this is quite inefficient and not a very good idea. And the reason is, actually there's, I guess, 4 reasons. Reason 1, it's extremely difficult to guess correctly what is likely to be a topic. Sometimes you get this right, like before Australs, everyone guessed there was going to be a motion about Bangladesh, and there was a motion about Bangladesh. So we all kind of like, I guess some people did quite well because of that. But it's, generally speaking, very difficult to work out what motions are going to be said. Because only like, especially in BP, only 7 or 8 topics get said. Of those 7 or 8 topics, probably hundreds for a major were proposed and debated, and most of them were abandoned, not because of the topic area, but because like the topic didn't work, right? It was like biased towards one side, or it was like not deep enough, or people just didn't like it, or they thought people wouldn't be able to understand it. So it's extremely unlikely that if you research one particular thing and spend hours and hours researching it, that one particular thing will ever be the subject of a topic. So it's pretty inefficient to do that. But even if you do have a lot of spec knowledge about something, it's actually quite hard to make that like work for winning a debate for 3 reasons. First, it's hard to remember what you will get more than the info slide. So if the motion is like about Bangladesh, for example, that motion came with an info slide. And the info slide kind of gave you everything you needed to know, right? So it's a bit of an advantage that I knew a lot about specifically Bangladesh's policies for Rohingya refugees. But it wasn't that much of an advantage because plenty of other people would figure that out from the info slide. Secondly, if you go beyond the info slide, everyone's just gonna be like, well, this guy just asserted something, right? Like they're not gonna, they'll very easily say, well, there's no proof of it. And so in order to properly get that to land, you need like second order proofs, right? You need to be like, well, Bangladesh's policy is like this because of these 4 factors about Bangladesh. So you need to go the step up. And that means you need not just like the initial things you know to be true, but a series of reasons why the things you know to be true are themselves true. And that is quite difficult, right? Like that takes a lot of memory. And like, I don't know, I have a very bad memory. So I will do this and then I'll just forget everything in the debate. Yeah, Eleanor.
Useless anecdote, but that is very true, such that at a mini one of my partners attended. CG in their room literally got the second by claiming that Japan was in an inflationary crisis, where famously, and if you read any article, they're not, just because they said that the other team which said this is true, asserted everything.
Yeah, so you can very easily just be like, oh, the other team, they just asserted stuff. Like, they didn't prove it, right? So knowing things isn't useful if you can't prove them, which is very difficult to do. The final reason it's kind of inefficient to like sit down and have a mega matter file is that the extent to which knowing something helps you in a debate is quite suspicious, right? Like, what it mostly does is it builds credibility. So for example, there's an Australs motion that was about the Ukrainian military operations in Sudan and Syria. And I know nothing about this. I happen to know a lot about the war in Sudan. So I kind of just like dropped a bunch of names of people in Sudan in the hope that would enhance my credibility. They're like, he just said Omar al-Bashir, he knows the name. That means he must know about the war, and therefore he's good and we should trust him. That might work a little bit, some judges might believe it, but a lot of the time it's pretty inefficient, right? It's not gonna help you win debates, it's not making better arguments. So, my conclusion from that is that I think it's pretty inefficient to spend a lot of time trying to guess what motions are gonna be written about and trying to turn those motions into information you have for yourself. Does that all make sense? Cool. While I leave this up for a second, does anyone have any questions? If you want to debate, feel free to scan that QR code and sign up. I'll let that up while people scan that. Cool. It's the same one as earlier. So if you did it earlier, it's the same one. But this is just again for people who came later. All right. Let's move on to the substantive part of this seminar, which is talking about when knowing things can actually be quite helpful. And I want to caveat what I said earlier, which is it's pretty unlikely that a motion that you get, or that something you research, will be about motion, right? That motion will not likely be about the thing that you've researched. But it is often likely that the thing you've researched will be implicated in a motion. So it's pretty unlikely if you research, say, like Japanese monetary policy, that you're ever gonna get a motion which is like, that Japan should abandon its like negative monetary policy ratio, right? Pretty unlikely you get that motion. But very likely you get a motion about monetary policy generally, or you get a motion about Japan generally, or you get a motion about like international finance generally, right? So that knowledge is likely to come in handy, even if it is, I guess, not likely to be something set as a topic. So what I think knowledge in IR tends to do is it tends to do one of four things. Firstly, it can be an extension. So if you think of a debate about like Japan's monetary policy, and you happen to know a lot about like Abenomics, which is the, I guess, leadership policy of the previous leader, Shinzo Abe. And if you know about that, then maybe your extension is just the Japanese government would do this really poorly because Shinzo Abe said to do it a certain way, and they would follow Shinzo Abe, and therefore they would do it badly. Yeah? So an extension is generated purely out of having that knowledge. The second thing you can do is you can use it as inspiration for a broader extension. So maybe the debate isn't about Japan, but it's about like international monetary policy. And you go, well, maybe I know in Japan it works this way, so maybe I can assume that it's likely to work that way in other places, and that's going to generate an idea for an extension. The third thing it can do is to provide an example or a frame. So even if you can't turn the Japanese monetary policy knowledge into an actual extension, what you can do is give it as a frame to explain, well, likely monetary policy works this way. Here's an example, yeah? Fourth thing you can do is, at minimum, it can just be like an example or a response, right? Like you can just say as a mechanism, well, it works this way in Japan, if like it would work this way somewhere else, yeah? So, the TLDR of what's gonna happen for the rest of the seminar is I think the best way to get good at IR debates is to read about things that fit two criteria. Firstly, you find it interesting. So you're not spending like 3 or 4 hours like reading about something you find totally boring, right? Maybe ahead of a major you do this, almost always you should just like read about stuff you find interesting. Secondly, you should read about something that implicates a lot of different debates at different times. So maybe that's something that is about a country, but also that country's like social movements, right? It's about the culture of that country. For example, I read for Indonesia about Indonesian horror films and the way they kind of interact with the world film market. So if you get a film debate, that's useful because you know about the film debates in Indonesia. If you get a debate about Indonesia, it's useful because you can see an example. If you get a debate about like culture or like movies more broadly, maybe it's at least an example or a mechanism, yeah? So you want to find something that fits those two criteria. It's interesting and it's likely to implicate a lot of debates. And then what you want to do is you want to quote unquote matter file it, but you're not really doing the like 200-page matter file. You're just doing like a short matter file where you give yourself information about that one specific thing. So the way you do that is you find a general explainer. The best example is the FT, the Financial Times, has like a big read section where it's like a quite long news article about something. So you read that news article, you take notes as you go. And as you take notes, if you write down a word that you don't understand, then you just figure out what that means. Or if you get an example and like that example seems important, you go research that example. For example, if you want to learn about like economics, you want to learn how banks work, a really useful thing to do is just like find a modern news article about banks. And then each bit that you get that you don't understand, it's like, it's about like the Volcker rule or something. You then go into Investopedia and you Google, what is the Volcker rule? And then you research in Investopedia. And you keep going until you eventually understand stuff. So you can kind of build up a file where, from first principles, you're essentially teaching yourself by Googling how something works. And then thirdly, once you kind of have that basis, you then add onto it. So you go look at like all the major news sites, things like The Guardian or like the Sydney Morning Herald or the FT or The Economist, and you read those sites and they'll tell you everything about this that has happened in the last 10 years. So you can update yourself, right? And have your file broaden out now that you know the information. So what I want to do now is give you an example of three things I've done that for and how I think it's useful in debates. So the first one is a question you might have if you ever look at a map of the world, which is, why do the French have a currency of 14 African countries? That is, if you look at the map of everyone's currencies, why do 14 countries have the CFA franc when the franc doesn't even exist anymore because they use the euro? And this is a fairly plausible question. The answer is that the French control the currency of these countries because they have, through the colonial period and then after the post-colonial period through political control, enforced the use of the CFA franc as a mechanism of exchange rate. So these countries have their own currency, but their own currency is only exchangeable with the French euro. So the only way you buy something in, for example, Mali, if you have Australian dollars, is to go to the French treasury, be like, here are my Australian dollars, give me CFA, give me euros, and then you go back to the French treasury, like, here are my euros, give me the CFA franc, and then you can buy something, right? So the reasons, this seems kind of abstract, right? But in a second, let me explain that knowing about how this works is going to help you in about like 15 different debates that are really commonly set, and it's going to give you a bunch of extensions that win you those debates. So in these 14 countries, it does four things. Firstly, it gives you a fixed exchange rate. So that's now relative to the euro. So it's like you can only buy things in that country from that currency, and you can only buy it through the euro. Secondly, there's free movement of capital. So think of what that means for businesses, for example. If you are a business in the EU, you can invest in Mali or Burkina Faso or any other country that has the CFA franc without any tariffs because you can freely move your capital. They can't control the foreign exchange reserves. You can just kind of build your business wherever you want, right? Barring state regulations, you have total control to take your money out of that country. So for example, most countries that are developing say, no, you need to spend most of your capital inside the country so that if you spend all your money, then you'll give it back to my country and you'll make reserves. That can't happen in these countries, right? The people in the uranium mines don't get anything back because the uranium companies just like take all their stuff, sell it back in France and convert it away. Thirdly, there's free convertibility with the anchor currency, but only the anchor currency, which is what I'm saying a second ago. So for example, if you live in Nigeria and you want to go buy something from countries literally next to you, you have to go through the French treasury, right? You can't go just buy stuff, which means it's really hard for these countries to trade with anyone but France because it introduces a second layer of inefficiency and a second layer of like broker costs, right? Like you have to pay someone to transfer that, and you have to pay two people because you're doing the transfer twice. And fourthly, you have the centralization of foreign exchange reserves, which sounds weird, but basically just means these countries give France like everything, like 90% of their gold, like most of their like printing press is there, like kind of everything is owned by France. So these countries have no capacity to like spend money doing like macroeconomic policy because everything is just owned by France. Yeah? And the reason this all exists, when it sounds like kind of a raw deal for these countries, is that France has a lot of institutional control. So in 1994, when essentially the French economy was doing kind of badly and they needed to devalue it, so their economy started doing better, they just got together with the IMF and they said, okay guys, you're going to tell these people that they need to make these reforms. And we're going to tell them that unless they make these reforms, we're going to stop cooperating with the system and the countries is going to collapse. And then they work together and force these countries to accept a devaluation. So they kind of have a lot of sustained systemic pressure that they can use to kind of control these countries. And the reason they do this, and I would note also, they did this in 2016 to stop these guys taking Chinese aid. So if you look at a map of like where the Chinese government gives aid to countries in Africa, these countries in the bloc, in the CFA franc, in West Africa, just take like none of the aid. And like Nigeria will take far more, the DRC takes far more, because they've been forced not to. And so the reason the French do this is it's really useful for their economy, right? Like their, companies can go into these countries and get privileged access to African natural resources. Also, it's risk-free, right? There's no risk of like, oh, your money gets stuck in that country and you have to take it out. You just automatically get to take your money out, right? Like if there's a crisis or like their currency collapses, you just take all your money out and you can leave with no cost, yeah? It's also useful for the French political pressure. So for example, in the 2010 Ivorian election, a guy called Laurent Gbagbo was refusing to leave power, and the French were just like, okay, we're just gonna nuke your country by like making sure that you can't get any money until you get him out of power. And this eventually worked. But it's obviously really bad for the countries in the central franc zone, right? Because it means most of what our central bank does is not maintaining a pegged exchange rate. Most of what the Australian central bank does is like macroeconomic stability. It does stuff like printing money to develop growth or create inflation or decrease inflation, etc. These countries can't do any of that because they're spending all of their money making sure that their exchange rate is the same as the French exchange rate. And even if they had leftover money, they then go give it to France for safekeeping. So they have very little control to do anything. So the reason that that weird economics lesson is useful is because it actually matters for an enormous amount of debates. And this is, like, to be clear, not like based on doing a metaphor. I just read a book, which is a really good book by Fanny Pago. It's called Africa's Last Colonial Currency. Very good book. It takes like 200 pages. After that, you have a series of extensions that are extremely useful in a wide range of debates. Obviously, any direct example, so for example, 2020 CDC, which is a Macquarie tournament, said this house supports the abolition of the CFA franc. So if you get that debate, you're golden, right? But it's pretty unlikely you get that debate. So the set of debates you can use this in is pretty broad. Firstly, if you get any debate about post-colonial countries or neo-colonial countries, a key mechanism in those debates is how much does the previous government control the current government, right? And it's very difficult to prove substantively why a post-colonial power would be controlled by its former colonial overlord. But it's very easy to be like, well, if you are one of these countries, then France directly runs your economy. And to say, probably using this as an example, other countries have similar structures where likely the post-colonial power has some economic influence over you to this day. So you can use that both as an example, like an extension would just be like, in the CFA franc countries, it works this way. Or you can use it as an example to prove that in other cases, it's likely to work the same way. Similarly, if you talk about France or the EU, any debate that's about their monetary policy affects these guys almost more than it does anyone else, right? Like these 14 countries are affected way more by French monetary easing than France itself is. So you could say, well, actually, these are the most important impacts. Similarly with foreign policy. And the thing I would note about all of these is here, you'll talk about the most vulnerable stakeholder. So the reason it's really useful to make this argument is if top half spend the whole debate talking about like French monetary policy, and then you can come up at CG and be like, well, actually, this debate should really be about the Central African countries, and they are far more important, right? Like they are way more vulnerable, they're way more developing, people there need support far more than French people do. Then you can very easily win the debate by outweighing them. Thirdly, any debate about currency policy, so debates like this house supports this house prefers a fixed exchange rate to a floating one, or vice versa. Floating being it's kind of like not pegged to anything, fixed being it's pegged to something else. Those kinds of debates, very easy, similar to de-dollarization. All of them implicate these countries. So again, a CG extension is just like, well, if we switch to a floating currency, then likely this would mean all the colonial countries did, and that means they're now politically independent. It means they now have far more economic control over themselves. And that's already a win, right? That's a substantive win for CG that probably wins you the debate. Finally, any debate about West Africa. So for example, Easter's 2024, like this year's novice competition, if anyone went there, the semi-final was like that ECOWAS should sanction the Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, who had all had kind of coups, and they'd been fighting with ECOWAS, which is run by Nigeria, right? Nigeria is not part of the CFA franc. No one in ECOWAS is. But those three countries are. So the reason it's kind of a broken debate is that ECOWAS sanctions against them do literally nothing, because those sanctions just mean that you can't trade with ECOWAS. But because of the CFA franc system, no one was already trading with those countries because it was so hard to buy stuff that like any trade that was happening was already illegal. And if that trade that was happening was already illegal, then probably isn't affected by the sanctions anyway. So either closing team can just get up and be like, well, actually, the sanctions are irrelevant. Therefore, I guess as CG would say, it's totally fine to remove them because that doesn't mean they're very important. Or as CO would say, well, the harms that OG point to as the sanctions causing these problems is not actually very big because those harms only occur, I guess, if the sanctions work, and the sanctions don't work or they're not very important. So all of that is to say, knowing a little bit about a certain like random set of countries' like monetary policy is really useful in a very wide variety of debates. And I think what the skills you get good at is just over time, you notice this thing happening more and more, where you read about a certain thing and you go, okay, this certain information is likely to implicate a whole wide variety of debates. And if you keep doing that, then eventually you're going to build up this bank of information that's quite useful. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Awesome. How much time do I have? 20 minutes. Lovely. Okay, 2 more examples. Next example is on international law. This is just kind of a personal preference one, but I think it's really interesting. It implicates a lot of debates. Many people think that international law has absolutely no relevance, right? Like it's the kind of common perception. It's like, lol, the International Criminal Court, it's indicted like 20 people. How can it be useful if it's just done that? And that is true. And many courts vary in their success. But what I think is useful is if you know why international courts can be successful, that's useful in an enormous range of debates, right? Any debate that's about war, for example, if you can prove that one side gets better access to justice afterwards, that's actually often a very important impact. Like, hey, what was the debate at, well, it's the semi-final that Mark was in about,
Bullshit funds.
yeah. The one about like pact of forgetting.
Oh, right. It's like in post-conflict states, we like forget about everything.
Yeah. So it's like emotionally we should like forget about stuff, right? And like after post-conflict states. Easy extension. This hurts international justice massively, right? It's really, really difficult to get control over these international states. It's very difficult to implicate justice if you don't have information about what's going on. So, when can international law be effective? I would say a couple of things. First thing I'd say is that many international tribunals exist beyond just the one you know about, which is the International Criminal Court. And actually, as it goes, that's not one of the very effective ones. For the reason, and it's kind of technical, they have a principle called complementarity, which essentially means if another state, literally any other state in the world, is investigating that person for that conduct, the ICC doesn't do anything. So they can only step in when literally everyone else in the world has decided not to, which is less a restriction than it sounds like, because oftentimes this is in context where the government doesn't exist and so no one can investigate them. But nonetheless, it means the ICC has, in its lifetime, indicted 57 people. Of those 57 people, 20 are fugitives, and by fugitives we mean they're Vladimir Putin and no one's getting them. And of those people that are fugitives, almost none of them will ever come. 32 people have had proceedings concluded. A lot of them got off on technicalities. So the ICC hasn't actually effectively limited, or I guess tried a lot of people. A good example of that is Putin is technically under an ICC warrant. So technically, when he went to South Africa for the BRICS summit, he should have been arrested by the South African government. But they don't care, right? They're not going to arrest him for that. So almost no one complies with these warrants. Similar thing with Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, with the two Israeli leaders, where the prosecutor is now seeking warrants against them. Even if those warrants are granted, say Netanyahu went to the US Capitol to give a speech again, the US police aren't going to arrest him and then deport him to The Hague. So, vast majority of the time, this ICC is not very useful. Another good example of an international court that does not work is the WTO AB, which is the World Trade Organization Appeals Board, and their job is meant to be, if there are any disputes between countries over trade, they will come in and adjudicate the dispute. The only problem is, Trump did this, and then Biden kept doing it, which is really evil. They stopped appointing people, and the board has a rule that if you don't have appointments, that not enough people sitting on the board, they cannot rule on anything. So for the last 4 years, they've just not worked, right? They've done nothing. Literally no country can go to the WTO appeals board anymore. It's just deleted from existence. Some countries, like South Korea and Belgium, have set up a replacement where they informally agree to do it with each other. But basically, World Trade hasn't had an appeals court to deal with any problem in the last 4 years. So easily, international law can break. And that's very useful, I guess, as examples if you want to talk about why international law is not very useful. But the comment I would make is there are a series of other ways in which international law can often be very useful and important. I'll give you 2 examples. First example is ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal for the Law on the Sea, which was set up by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which sounds really random, who cares about maritime law? But it's actually the most important treaty, or one of the most important treaties in the world, because it binds the most countries. So 169 countries in the world are bound by UN laws on the law of the sea. And ITLOS is actually crazy radical, which is really interesting. Recent rulings in the 2010s, they gave a series of arbitrations where they said that essentially the Philippines owns the area in the South China Sea that China claims. So the Philippines claim to own those areas, and their ability to go out and physically say, we're occupying this land, their ability to put soldiers there without it being an act of war, is because the ITLOS tribunal has declared they technically own those areas. It's within their exclusive economic zone. Very recently, they ruled that greenhouse gases are pollution, which sounds very kind of like milquetoast, obviously they're pollution. The reason that's interesting is that everyone who signed the UN clause has signed a binding treaty that says they will not let their pollution hurt other countries and get into other countries' areas. Problem being, greenhouse gases obviously get into everyone else's areas, right? You can't stop greenhouse gases being in only American airspace. You can't have a big wall. So technically, the ITLOS tribunal is every single country in the world, or I guess 169 of them, have a legal obligation to immediately stop producing all greenhouse gases, which is about to be interpreted by the UN International Court of Justice have a case on this, and they're about to probably gonna walk that back a bit. But nonetheless, that's a tribunal with an enormous amount of power, making rulings that bind countries that say you can't do climate change, which is pretty interesting. The other example that I think is useful to establish that these tribunals work is the International Court of Justice. So the ICJ is the less famous of the two that sit in The Hague, but it's by far the more important. So it's done far more cases, far more interesting stuff than the International Criminal Court. It does 2 things. So firstly, it adjudicates contentious cases, which is where there are 2 member states. They've both said, we agree to your jurisdiction. So for example, you can't do it against countries that, like the US, that haven't agreed to jurisdiction. But 2 member states that have both said, we agree to your jurisdiction, we agree you're competent, you can then sue each other and the rulings are binding. Good example of this is South Africa versus Israel. So if anyone's been following the provisional orders in that case, a lot of them are Israel must immediately withdraw from Rafah because it's in Rafah it is causing genocide. Those kinds of cases are South Africa suing Israel for breaching the Genocide Convention. Another good one is Nicaragua v. Germany. So that is where Nicaragua has sued Germany for giving aid to Israel, because if Israel is committing war crimes, providing aid to Israel is illegal under international law. So those are kind of cases that are very progressive. The other thing they can do is they can give advisory opinions, and that's where like a group, usually the UN General Assembly, but it could be a bunch of other people, go to them and say, can you tell us what the law is, yeah? And some good examples of that is there was an advisory opinion on the occupied Palestinian territories, and if you've been reading the news, this is one that came out like a few weeks ago, and it was like crazy big, it was huge, because the whole thing was like, since, I guess, the occupation of Gaza in 2014, almost all Israeli activities in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal. It declared they amount to either racial segregation or apartheid, and declared a bunch of things that states have to do. So for example, Australia, if it actually cared about its international legal obligations, is under an international legal obligation to no longer provide aid to Israel because it is occupying Palestinian territory. The other really interesting one is Vanuatu has done one on climate change, which is in its early stages. One of my friend's sisters is working on it. It's still like a couple of years off, but this is the one where if they give this ruling down, it will probably say that countries have to do way more to meet their Paris obligations. The interesting things about the ICJ and the reasons that you can argue it is useful are threefold. Firstly, I would note in debates that once upon a time, the Global South hated the ICJ. And the reason they did is that in the 1960s, there were a bunch of cases that were like, is South Africa legally occupying Namibia? And the ICJ was like, yeah, man, it's awesome. Like, they're so cool. And they just dropped a bunch of rulings that said that South Africa is amazing and that apartheid is really cool, essentially. Not that's a bit of oversimplification. But the Global South hated them. And for 20 years after that, refused to cooperate with anything. That has now changed. So things like South Africa v. Israel, Nicaragua v. Germany, the advisory opinion on the occupied Palestinian territories, which are taken by the General Assembly, and the Vanuatu AO. All of them are requested by global South countries or small countries. So it is increasingly something that's being used by other countries. The second thing that's interesting is it's increasingly judicialized. And what that means is active conflicts, like things like the war in Palestine, are literally being adjudicated as they go on, which is a big change from the past, right? Traditionally, you didn't do that. What you did is, after the conflict was over, then the courts come in and they're like, okay, this is illegitimate, you did this thing illegally, we're gonna sanction you. That's no longer happening. Yeah, Christian?
Yeah, what do they do in the case where countries just like ignore the rule?
Nothing, sorry. Sorry, yes.
Debate winning POI.
So yeah, debate winning POI. So the ICJ has no enforcement powers in and of itself, but it does impose legal requirements on other countries. So for example, some states in the world say that if an ICC arrest warrant is issued, that state must legally comply, like Kenya and Uganda have that rule. So for example, I guess Putin can't go to Uganda because he is legally required by that country to be arrested. But they also, I guess, build up a lot of pressure. So for example, Palestine is internationally recognized as a state under a lot of international law. That builds up a lot of pressure. It makes it very difficult for the US to argue that the Palestinian authorities that they're negotiating with are not in fact states. The final thing that's really interesting is that the ICJ cares a lot about maintaining big majorities. So they want to maintain like they've got 15 judges, right? One of them is really crazy and will always vote for Israel, but of the 14 judges, they really want all 14 of those judges to agree to everything. So what they do a lot of the time is they maintain a lot of ambiguity, and they give these rulings that are kind of like satisfying everyone in a way that also satisfies no one. And this is also something that you should talk about in debates about international law. So the really famous one is in the South Africa Israel case, there was a question of Rafah. So this was back in March when Israel was about to launch an offensive into Rafah, and huge numbers of Palestinians were sheltering there. And the case is on the Genocide Convention. So the question is by doing that Rafah intervention, Israel threatening the existence of the Palestinian people in whole or in part? And the ICJ says, well, Israel shall immediately halt its military offensive, comma, and any other action in the Rafah government, comma, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life, etc., etc. Question is, do those commas mean they must withdraw from Rafah totally, or they must only withdraw from the things in Rafah that lead to genocide? And Israel says, obviously, well, nothing we do in Rafah leads to genocide. So Israel's interpretation of that is nothing changes. They just said we shouldn't do stuff in there that causes genocide. So the ICJ kind of has to finagle these ways of like wording things in really tricky ways to get people to agree. And the question is whether that's worth it. And it's a bit dubious as to whether that's actually a good idea. So all of that is international law. The thing about all of that is, for the reasons I explained earlier, that implicates a huge number of different debates, right? It obviously implicates a series of debates about international law itself, but it also implicates debates about what we should do in conflicts. Should we have transitional justice now, or should we have justice referred to international courts? And then you can start to look at whether international courts do their job well, whether they're likely to be particularly effective. All right, any questions before I move on? Okay, this is the last time, I promise this is the last slide of me like yapping about a certain international thing. Then we get into some final thoughts. So, final slide is slide 3, and this answers a question some of you may have had if you were at BP Novice in the grand final, which is I set up a little bit of a reference to my own slides by including in the info slide there that Rwanda does peacekeeping in northern Mozambique. And the question is, why does Rwanda do that, right? Like, it's obviously, it's a quite a developed country, but it has a lot of better things to be doing than A, being the 4th largest contributor to UN peacekeeping, B, sending 4,000 troops to Cabo Delgado, which is in northern Mozambique, as well as the Central African Republic and Benin, and C, doing a bunch of other stuff. Like, for example, if you followed British politics, you might follow that, like, the key Tory party policy was, we're gonna send all our refugees to Rwanda. And the question you might ask is, like, why does Rwanda want to do that? Like, why would they take British refugees? And the answer is, well, I guess there's a couple answers. Rwanda's answer, which is like so fake, is, well, we learned from our experiences in the genocide, so we just like really care about international law and really want to uphold all these things. Obviously a bit of a lie. Answer 2, which some people believe, I will clarify, like, some people believe this, I believe another answer. It's perfectly legitimate to believe this is an economic thing. So for example, in northern Mozambique, the FT recently reported that all the contracts that Mozambique is giving to security companies are to security companies owned by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which is the group that runs Rwanda. So very plausibly, Rwanda is just doing it so that like other companies will pay them back in like secret ways that can be channeled back to the regime. But I think answer 3 is the most interesting one, which is this is a way for Rwanda to control its international image, both directly, that is, we're really awesome because we do all this peacekeeping, and indirectly, because all the peacekeeping they do just so happens to be in the areas where Western countries have incredibly important economic interests. For example, Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique happens to have a problem with jihadist insurgency, but it also happens to have the French energy firm Total Energy, which is owned by the French government, and some of their largest extraction, right? So most French oil comes from that particular region. And what that means is, the French government is far more beholden to Rwanda these days, because if Rwanda pulls out its troops, the French government's over, right? Like their energy firm gets blown up by terrorists. So that creates a system of dependency. Same thing is true for uranium mines, which the US government cares a lot about, which in all of the countries Rwanda is garrisoning. And I think another good example is like, if the British government wants to talk about Rwanda, Rwanda will just be like, okay, we no longer work with your refugee deal. And then like that deletes the British government, right? So for the Tory government, they didn't have the capacity to talk about Rwanda. The reason I would care about its international image is because Rwanda does a bunch of bad stuff. Bad stuff number 1 is it does standard like authoritarian government repression. For example, it assassinated a bunch of people in South Africa, which is like super illegal, right? Like you definitely should not be doing assassinations in other countries. But secondly, Rwanda, after a series of wars that occurred after its genocide, has incredibly important interests in basically stealing all of the resources of the Congo. So they maintain a rebel group that they run and they fund and they totally are like behind it, like everyone agrees they're behind it. And that rebel group does pretty terrible stuff. And it also just so happens to ship crazy amounts of lithium, crazy amounts of copper, crazy amounts of diamonds back to Rwanda. Rwanda is like the world's 3rd biggest exporter of diamonds, and there are no diamonds in Rwanda. So there are just like a crazy amount of stuff coming across the border. So the reason that Rwanda is doing all this stuff recently is that in 2013, when Rwanda started funding M23, the West got its act together, like, nah man, you cannot do that. We will take away all your aid, and Rwanda is dependent on aid, unless you just remove them. But now that they're doing it again, M23 is far worse now than it was 10 years ago. The West is doing nothing. And in fact, they're actively positive about it. So for example, France just gave them €500 million. All the British Commonwealth meetings are now being hosted in Rwanda for the next year and a half. So what this I guess, example tells us is this is a really good example of how stuff is interconnected, yeah? So what I was telling in slide 3 back here is you can still know, it's useful to know things if those things are interconnected with each other, right? It's useful to know a lot about one thing if that implicates a bunch of different topics. Another way to do that, Mattify, is to talk about Rwanda, where you can say, okay, this one example implicates a bunch of different things. So if I ever get a debate about peacekeeping, my like frame is just gonna be like, the reason that Western peacekeeping is really good is because it stops evil countries like Rwanda doing it. Or if you get a debate about like green technology, a lot of the notions about green technology is most of the stuff comes from the Congo. So there's easy arguments to be made about like how this affects Rwandan government policy if they can't stop stealing all the material from the Congo, etc. So you can just find these kind of specific topic areas that A, you find interesting to research, and B, they implicate a bunch of different motions. And that then means it's an extension for almost every debate you want to do. Does that make sense? All right, that's enough from me of specific examples. I'm happy to talk about more in person. But the last thing I want to end with is just some sources. So I've tried to refer to books here and there as I go, but I want to talk briefly about other ways to get good at, or I guess find out about these things. These are some news sites. The Economist is like mega overrated. Everyone in debating says it's awesome. It's really not that useful for learning about stuff. The FT is way better. I do not endorse pirating these things using the website 12foot.io, but if you do want to pirate them, you would theoretically use the website 12foot.io, which will get rid of the paywall for you. These are some other ones. These ones are news organizations. These ones are research. So ACLED is where I keep up on like Sudan and other kind of conflicts like that. Regular publications, New Lines is really good for Middle Eastern politics. The London Review of the Books is not, weirdly spends a lot of time looking at stuff that aren't books, but in very good ways. And if you care about Substack, which is something I never really got into, Jordan Gibson did a Twitter thread a while ago, which is like,
It's bad.
it's bad. Her Twitter thread or Substack generally?
Substack that she recommends is bad.
Oh really? Which one's bad?
Noah Smith she recommends.
Oh yeah, Noah Smith's medieval, that's true. So you could go to her tweet, ignore the Noah Smith one, and just take the rest. Second thing, if you're a podcast person, I really love podcasts. These are the ones I use to keep on track. I've underlined the ones I think are really good, but the rest of them are also quite good. So I would keep track of some of these podcasts. The ones I've highlighted, London Review of Books, great podcasts. Obviously don't listen to all of them, but a lot of them will relate to stuff about international affairs. Political Fix, good for British politics. Unhedged, very good for economic affairs. Blowback is very good for kind of modern Middle Eastern politics. And Call to the Bar is good if you want to know anything about the international law I was talking about back here. And the very last thing I want to talk about before we finish is I want to talk a little bit about history, not just because I'm a history major, but also because I think it makes you quite good at international relations. And the reason is, for the thesis explained in David Graeber and David Wenger's excellent book, The Dawn of Everything, where the argument they make is, we are very conditioned to seeing a teleological view of history, where we assume just because things are the way they are now, they were inevitably the way they are. And that book is about anthropology, so it's about how, well, we assume that like agricultural revolution was a good thing that happened a bunch of places, or like the origin of the state was inevitable. So once you started having complex relationships, everyone had to organize into the state. Those things are not inevitable. But I think more recent history is also really useful in IR debates. So two examples are, Haitian post-revolutionary history has a lot of really good examples of why people often reject forms of the economy that we think are very natural and normal. So for example, after Haiti, after the Haitian Revolution, the GDP of Haiti, if you map it, goes from like here to like here, right? Like it collapses. So from an orthodox developmental perspective, their life just ended, right? Like they had a really bad life. But that was because everyone in Haiti hated like productive things, because that's like slave plantations that produce sugar, and almost all of them wanted to go work subsistence farming in the hills where the government couldn't touch them. And from, I guess, an orthodox developmental perspective, that's a bad idea, right? Like your country doesn't develop, or like you don't get productive things like air conditioning or whatever. But for the people that had been through the slave revolution, that was awesome. That was exactly what they wanted, right? They really wanted to have the freedom to live outside of the state's control and the freedom to produce economically independently. So if you get other debates about like, should we develop this way? Should we force countries to develop? That's a really good example. The last one is the WA state in Myanmar, which is kind of a random example, but there's a lot of discourse about Myanmar at the moment because the rebel groups in their civil war are winning very successfully. And it looks like post-civil war, the rebel groups are just going to kind of have a bunch of autonomous ethnic enclaves. And so everyone's like, oh no man, it's like balkanization, like the Serbs and the Croats, it's like the same thing, they're all just going to kill each other. But actually Myanmar has never had control over its territory. So the WA state has been independent of Myanmar for like 100 years or however long Myanmar's been around. But it doesn't matter because they just cooperate with the Myanmarese government. And that I think problematizes a lot of the assumptions you have in debating, where like in debating people will be like, oh no, this local government has too much autonomy. It's about to go do a bunch of wars and there'll be conflicts over that. That's not inevitable. That's not always how it works. So it's useful to kind of build up a bank of examples from history that can kind of help you go, okay, maybe things are the way they are because of a reason, but that doesn't mean things will always be the same way, or that if things are different, that would be bad. So I think it's useful to kind of think about that as well. I just put this map up here because if you look at like the bit that has no conflict, that's like Myanmar's conflict over the last year. The bit that has no conflict is WA state. So they basically avoided the entire civil war, even though the rest of the country is like totally engulfed by it. So it's kind of an interesting example. All right, thank you. That's the sign-up code. Hopefully everyone's already signed up. Any questions? Wonderful. Thanks, guys.